It comes as no surprise that throughout the decades, women have served as a vital and integral part of American history. From being the pillar of the home to serving in business and the military and back again, women have made great strides in the roles many have today. During wartime in the mid-1900s, women were fighting the same war, but in many different variants. Females were taking on roles as never before and surpassing the expectations of many. As quoted from a book called Our Mother's War by Emily Yellen, "Hail to the women of America! Just as the women of other wars, you have taken your positions as soldiers on the home front. The efforts and accomplishments of women today are boundless." After the attacks upon Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1941, the United States joined in on World War II. Entering the war dramatically changed the predefined gender roles across America. Some women joined the female portion of the armed forces. Most had to become the breadwinners while equally maintaining the roles of wife and mother. Some homemakers were now forced into factories, typically male-dominated roles, in order to provide for their families, while the male figures in their lives were sent off to war. Some of the contributions that were made by these women who stepped up to fill in missing men's spots were factory jobs, where they made clothing, ammunition, food rations, and many other types of support for the military. Many women who did not choose to participate in the war efforts or chose to participate in manual labor decided to volunteer their time to help aid those who made a different decision. With only 1/3 of the female population gainfully employed at the time, the remaining 2/3 were lending valuable time in other war efforts. Regardless of their current job title, women across America were left with the impossibility of maintaining your home. Women were first given the opportunity to start serving as nurses in continued war efforts in the later parts of World War I. Upon the arrival of World War II, there were nearly 60,000 women who served as nurses or on medical staff. Those who chose a path in nursing were given the opportunity to work near the lines of battle. Although other positions were made available for women to serve, most chose to work as nurses. Those were able to collect such benefits as retirement, pensions, and allowances for their dependents. Due to the short supply of nurses during the war, the military developed training programs that were led by women. These trainings were efforts to create more highly trained nurses that were capable of administering anesthesia, oxygen, injections, and handling crisis in the field regarding medical situations. Due to the ongoing segregation problem during World War II, the United States Army in particular employed very few black women as nurses. The United States Army had declared that black nurses were only permitted to perform their duties on black soldiers, and since there were minimal black soldiers, roughly 500 black women served as nurses during World War II. However, despite how few black nurses there were, they were still significant for meeting the military segregation rules of the time and allowed for an opportunity for black soldiers to receive medical care. As previously mentioned, women who did not fully delve into the war efforts were still able to contribute from home by volunteering their time. Though the subject had become sensitive, the media was desperately trying to influence women on the home front to volunteer towards the war effort. One way that women could volunteer was by sewing uniforms or doing rationing work for companies such as the American Red Cross and the Women's Land Army. The Women's Land Army was a program dedicated to the production of food. Not only were the members of the Women's Land Army significant to the production of food, but they helped out of farms and worked in agriculture in order to make sure the country was still producing crops, dairy, and meat. Another way that women could volunteer from home and be more involved with the war effort was by organizing recreational activities for the families left behind of the men who were serving in war. Many women chose to work in agriculture to pick up the slack of the men who left to serve. In May of 1942, Congress instituted the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, later upgraded to the Women's Army Corps, which had full military status. its members, known as WOCs, worked in more than 200 non-combatant jobs stateside and in every theater of war. Women were wanting to render support to assist the United States in winning World War II by any means necessary, even if that meant joining a branch of the military. In an article pulled from America on the Home Front dated for September 2nd, 1942, a grandmother from West Newton became the first woman chauffeur for the Waretown Arsenal. Gracie Grace, former beautician, was chosen to drive extremely high-ranking officials around. This was a huge step for women in regards to military service. Other ways that women were able to contribute to the war effort through service in the armed forces was by becoming a nurse, as mentioned above, or by working as a training officer for field medical support. Some women also had opportunity to become pilots as servicewomen, and they flew targets behind their aircraft for soldiers to use in training. African American women made meaningful gains in the labor force and United States Armed Forces as a result of the wartime labor shortage during the Second World War. But these advances were sharply circumscribed by racial segregation, which was legal in all parts of the country, and racism in the dominant culture. Even though it was deemed illegal to discriminate against the black population in not hiring them, the white workforce was so exhausted that employers had no other choice. This seemed as a step towards inclusion. The jobs made available to them were often dangerous, extremely tiresome, or the jobs that no one wanted. The women who joined the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, once it opened to African Americans, discovered the racism and segregation followed them into the military, just as it had followed the men of color. Nevertheless, the women soldiered on and it succeeded. And eventually, Charity Adams became the first official African American woman officer in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and commanded the 6,888th Central Postal Battalion. During World War II, women worked in factories producing ammunitions, building ships, airplanes, in the auxiliary services as air raid wardens, fire officers, and evacuation officers, as drivers of fire engines, trains, and trams, as conductors, and as nurses. During this period, some trade unions serving traditionally male occupations like engineering began to admit women members. With the ongoings of women in the male-dominated workforce, it began to raise some questions in regards to equal pay for women as well. The government created a propaganda campaign which depicted a woman who was tough and yet elegant named Rosie the Riveter. This campaign was created in the attempt to assure men at war that their women would not be too masculine upon their arrival home. Appearances were still held in high regard to some factories, would give lessons on how to apply makeup and how to use cosmetics in order to keep morale up. It was to show that women could work and still remain beautiful. Women in industry were also never rationed during that time, so they may keep up appearances. Women have pushed the limits and tested the boundaries for years upon years, and it would be unfair to say that they did anything less than miraculous work during World War II. There is no doubt that without the contributions of the female gender during World War II, that the outcome of the war could have been the same. Homes were kept up, businesses were run, and a war was won. Yes, it was a team effort by all involved, but credit needs to be given where it's due. As said by Eleanor Roosevelt, a woman is like a tea bag. You can't tell how strong she is until you put her in hot water.